In her new book, New York Times reporter Jo Becker takes a close look at a number of cases that stem from California's Proposition 8 and the fight for same-sex marriage rights. Now, earlier today, I spoke with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist about her book, Forcing Spring, Inside the Fight for Marriage Equality. You know, you set the stage in the book, and I think it kind of lays out in some of the reaction it's gotten also that many people may remember the movie Milk that won the Academy, and one of the folks intimately involved with the production of that movie gave a speech in March of 2009 talking about where he saw the direction of the fight for marriage equality going, and also his own address at the Academy and some of the reaction it got. Lay out a little bit about how the old guard and the new guard, with both the same common aim for equality, viewed this fight in much different terms, in one of both, I guess, patience and one in the fight for the here and now.
Yeah, I talk a lot about this in the book. When the book really centers on the decision, and it was a radical decision really at the time, to take this cause to the U.S. Supreme Court. At that time, and you have to cast back 5 years ago, it's almost hard to imagine. There's been so much progress since then. But at that time, you only had 2 states that allowed same-sex couples to marry, and you also only had you only had in the low 40s approval rate. So most Americans were opposed to the right for same-sex couples to marry, and so the decision to take this case to the Supreme Court was viewed as, by many of the establishment sort of gay rights legal groups that have been fighting these battles for decades, it was viewed as very premature. They were worried that the country wasn't ready and that the court wouldn't be ready. And so I described several scenes in the book. Lance Black, the Academy Award-winning screenwriter that you talked about, was at a thing called Outgiving, which is a gathering of big donors to gay rights causes. And he kind of very vaguely floated the idea of taking this cause federal, and it sparked a firestorm a little bit, and then later, when they actually when Lance and the group of people that came together, many of them Hollywood people, Rob Reiner, of course, the director of movies like When Harry Met Sally, and others, brought together the lawyers who had been involved in this fight for quite some time to say, look, this is what we're thinking about doing. It was like, you know, everybody kind of jumped in to criticize all at once. And like you said, it wasn't that they didn't share the goal. They did share the goal. The concern, though, was that a setback at the Supreme Court would deal a terrible blow to the movement. You know,
you were able to get, I mean, unbelievable access. For 4 years, you were there from, I guess, the formalization of the legal strategy, and you followed so many of the principles till obviously the Supreme Court's decision and even after. One of the people that you focus on, one of the plaintiffs here, is Chad Griffin. In fact, he was there in that same address that you were talking about in 2009. And his initial reaction with the chilly reception that Mr. Black got was, we're going to get killed here. Talk a little bit about him, because you talk about throughout the book, this is as much about a legal case as it was about a sales job to the American public, to try and change the American public, to put faces on these people here, and also to show the public this isn't something they should have to be afraid of. In fact, this is something they should support. And I guess Griffin's a good starting point for that.
Yeah, so Chad Griffin was a political consultant at the time. He's now the president of the Human Rights Campaign, the largest gay rights organization in the world. But at the time, he was a political consultant in LA. He'd cut his teeth in the Clinton White House. And, you know, when there's so many serendipitous turns in this book. There are too many to go to detail in the amount of time that we have here. But there was this sort of serendipitous moment at the Polo Lounge. He is gay, and he had gone there with Michelle and Rob Reiner. They were friends of his, to commiserate that California had passed Proposition 8. And the feeling was, well, if California could pass this, you know, where could they win? They were 0 for 30 at the ballot box. And so a friend of the Reiners happened to wander by and heard what they were talking about, and long story short said, you ought to talk to my ex-brother-in-law. He's a constitutional lawyer and I think he'd be interested in this. Well, it turns out the ex-brother-in-law was Ted Olson, and both Rob Reiner and Chad Griffin had been with the vice president on the night that Ted Olson won Bush v. Gore for Bush, and they were commiserating together with Vice President Gore. So they were sort of like, are you kidding me? But immediately, I think both of them grasped that this could be kind of game-changing. And so when they filed the lawsuit, and the lawsuit, of course, featured both Ted Olson and David Boies, his opponent in Bush v. Gore. So Rob Reiner joked he had both the winner and the loser. I think they both really understood that you could build a public education campaign around this litigation, that you could reframe this debate, what had largely been a very partisan political debate, into a bipartisan discussion about civil rights and American values. And one of the neat things for me as a reporter was getting the chance for 4.5 years. I was in the room. I was literally in the room as the lawyers debated strategy, and as Chad Griffin worked my colleagues in the media and crafted this public education strategy. One of the things, I'll just give you one example that he did, was he thought that the gay rights movement had always sort of been symbolized by the rainbow flag. Well, he didn't want this to be about gay rights. He wanted it to be about American rights and American fundamental rights. And so before the first day of trial, there was in the political war room that they put together, there were boxes ringing the room, and I asked him, well, what are in these boxes? And it was 2,000 American flags to be handed out on the opening day of the trial, and many, many more thousands of flags were bought along the way. But that's just sort of one example of sort of trying to kind of rebrand this cause. I think his thought and Olson and Boies' thought in allowing someone like me to document this fight from the inside was that if people read these plaintiff stories, that at the very least they would have their minds opened.
And I think throughout this trial, throughout the 4 years, I should say, you saw that it's more nuanced. It's not all white hats and black hats, that people, you couldn't put them in different silos here, even if they felt differently on the issue. There was more humanity to this and more interconnectivity than maybe on the surface it seemed.
Yeah, I mean, one really great example of that is Chris and Sandy and Jeff and Paul. They didn't ever really know that they were going to have to testify. Most of these cases had been decided, on the state level. This was the first federal case of its kind that went to go to the Supreme Court. But on the state level, there had been other cases, and they were described. It was sort of application of the state constitutions. There wasn't trials and testimony and so forth. Judge Walker, the judge in this case, decided, no, you need to prove it. If you're saying that for instance, that sexuality is not changeable, well, let's hear expert testimony on that. But Chris and Sandy and Jeff and Paul were really petrified to testify about what Chuck Cooper, the lawyer on the other side, would do to them. And it turns out that here they were thinking that they were speaking to an audience beyond the court, and to try to explain what their feelings were like, what it felt like to want something that everybody else could have and be told, no, you can't have it. In other words, to be married. But it turns out that that their testimony personally impacted Chuck Cooper, so much so that years later, after he lost the case, and he was watching on TV as Chris and Sandy got married, and watching this whole thing unfold, he told me, and I report about this in the book, that he couldn't help but rejoice in their happiness.
Joe, in the end, obviously, Hollingsworth v. Perry was not decided by the High Court, but instead Windsor was. With the principles that you had gotten so close with covering for over the years, I'm curious if they thought it was more important at the end of the day that the court of public opinion changed more so than the highest court of the land.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. So the goal initially was, when they filed this case, was to move public opinion. The goal was to have public opinion be at over 50% in support of same-sex marriage by the time this case reached the Supreme Court. And the reason was that the Supreme Court doesn't like to get too far out ahead of public opinion. Well, they did that. That goal was reached for many, many reasons, but this case and the reframing of the issues around this case, I think, played an important role in that. It turns out, though, that the justices were immune from the shift, and they decided this case on a procedural basis. So the basis was that Chuck Cooper's clients did not have the standing to appeal, the result of which was that the lower court decision saying that Proposition 8 was unconstitutional stood, and people began marrying again in California. So it wasn't the victory that they wanted. They wanted a 50-state, kind of big Brown v. Board of Ed kind of decision, but it was a really important decision nonetheless. And if you had been in California that day, you could see how important it was. And it was, it's 1/5 of the country suddenly being allowed to resume marrying.
Well, the book, again, is Forcing the Spring, and Joe Becker, I really appreciate the time here, and it's a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of history. It's like a legal thriller, and as I said, it puts a human face on sometimes what some is this a partisan issue, and in the end, it's I think just about basic decency and family. So I really appreciate the time. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
RFL will wrap things up when we come back.